Meine Damen und Herren, guten Abend. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Jean-Christophe Bas. I'm the CEO of the Dialogue of Civilization Institute. I'm very pleased to welcome you tonight for this third lecture of this new lecture series organized by the Dialogue of Civilization Institute that is called Meet in Mitte. Thanks for coming. For those of you who are not familiar with the Dialogue of Civilization Institute, it was created 2 years ago. It's a global think tank based here in Berlin, created in 2016, and that is a platform between the mainstream Western world and the rising world in order to shape together a sustainable, peaceful, new world order. And tonight we will be speaking about Europe. I'm extremely pleased and honored to welcome Alfred Gusenbauer, who will be telling us about his vision about Europe in a very specific context. As you know, we are just 6 months ahead of the European election. These elections will take place in a very specific context, the context of the Brexit, the context also of the migration crisis, the rise of skepticism about the European model, global challenges, the relation between Europe and the US, the relation between Europe and China, relation between Europe and Russia. So there is a very specific context for those European elections. And I think that in regards to the extreme complexity of the situation, nobody or very few people were uniquely placed as Alfred Gusenbauer to try to give us some guidance in this very complicated situation. And I think what I like very much in your experience, in your life, is that you will be offering us a kind of a multifaceted perspective. Dr. Gusenbauer has been during 2 years the Chancellor of Austria, so he has a very prominent political and leadership experience in Europe, but he is also a prominent leader in the business community, and as the member of the supervisory board of several international companies. But he is also coming up with a very specific academic and think tank experience as the former president of the Österreichisches Institute for International Politics, a fellow of the Columbia University, and a professor in Brown University, and last but not least for us, a member of the supervisory board of the Dialogue of Civilization Institute. I should also mention now that there's a better balance, because until a few minutes ago, there was a very strong presence on the white side of the room that Dr. Gusenbauer is a social democrat, so there was a bit of unbalance, and the left side was a little bit light, so now we have a good balance between both sides of it's not the hemicycle, but of the room. And I'd like also, this will be my last word of introduction, to say that Dr. Gusenbauer has been during many years a very prominent member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and this is actually the first time we met there in a previous incarnation, and because as a member of the Parliamentary Assembly, he was also the rapporteur of a very important project on supervising the Bretton Woods institution. And I would like also, because I'm mentioning the Council of Europe, to take this opportunity to welcome also Dr. Walter Schwimmer, who is another member of the supervisory board of the Dialogue of Civilization Institute and a former member of the Council of Europe. So we have lots of European knowledge and expertise with us tonight. Dr. Gusenbauer, you have the floor.
Does it work? Yes, yeah. Most seemingly. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to be back at the Dialogue of Civilizations here in Berlin. Actually, it's the second time that I have the chance to speak in front of an audience here in the Institute. And at the moment, that seems to be quite timely for the reflections that we are going to share this afternoon or early evening. My good old friend Barroso once described the dilemma of Europe with a phrase that he called, European Union is the nationalization of success and the Europeanization of problems. And this description seems to be quite accurate when one is looking to nowadays situation all around Europe. And of course, you are familiar with the situation in the large member states. But if you take it all together, it has some frightening aspects. We are witnessing the Brexit. We do not know if the British Prime Minister politically is going to survive this evening. We have a fundamental crisis in Spain around the issue of the Catalonian independence, which for quite some time one thought that a more diligent mastering of this crisis would bring Spain back to normal rather soon. But not least the regional elections in Andalusia showed that the crisis is much deeper, because it seems that any readiness of a Spanish government to solve the problem with the Catalans based on a mutual understanding is receiving quite broadly based resistance in all other parts of Spain. And part of the success of the ultra-rightist groups in Andalusia who entered the 109-seat parliament with 12 members, the main issue there was the question of Spanish identity. And they even demanded the entire abolition of regional parliaments, regional governments, so the entire devolution that has accompanied the history of Spanish democracy since the mid of the 70s, as an expression that they want to go back to the centralist Franquist state. And that such a notion finds quite significant support is, in my understanding, an expression of the deep constitutional crisis in Spain, where, of course, in order to get a resolution with the Catalans, there should be a movement from both sides. But on the other hand, the rest of Spain is reacting very, very hostile to any type of reconciliation. In Italy, we have the situation that inside Italy, the Cinque Stelle movement was breaking up the political system. But, and I want to underline that, as they had a leadership and as it was a top-down movement, they were able to be integrated into the political system with a different majority in government together with the Lega, but they continued the political system. This is the major difference between Italy and France, because the yellow jackets today in France, they are not a top-down movement, but a bottom-up movement without any visible leadership with whom one could negotiate solutions. And therefore the question is, to where will such a movement that is fundamentally challenging the political order in France, to where will that lead? Will it stop on basis of even more generous proposals of the French president? Will it disappear again? Or will those people that are fundamentally frustrated and who saw President Macron already as an attempt to destroy the old political system, but visibly in their understanding not connected with the results and the success that they wanted? Are they going for the next option, which is then to vote for Front National and Madame Le Pen, in order to get this more fundamental rejection of the political system done? Or will we witness new expressions of an old phenomena, which brings me back to Italy? Some of you might recall that the 1968 movement in Italy was a movement without any political leaders. It also was a broad-based, bottom-up movement. And the frustration of the 68 movement on its margins led to the coming into existence of the Brigate Rosse and of the terrorism that we were witnessing throughout the 70s and beginning of the 80s. So one cannot exclude anymore that when social movements are not finding a political structure via which they could change the political system or participate, that an alternative for those movements to disappearance is the re-emergence of margins of such a movement, also in a very violent way. In addition, Italy has the ongoing struggle with the European Union on budgetary limits. I think their situation is going to improve after the speech of President Macron on Monday, because now they are not alone anymore. And it will be much more challenging for the European Commission to deal with two of the major member states of the European Union in the way they so far discussed with Italy. In Poland, we have an interesting development where 85% of the population are ardent Europeans, and at the same time we are confronted with one of the most Eurosceptic governments of the entire European Union. And a country that is going to be more and more split in between the urban centers and the countryside, as it was expressed by the municipal elections that happened just recently in Poland, where the united opposition of liberals, social democrats, Greens, etc., was able to win all the big cities, but PiS, the party of Mr. Kaczynski, was able to win the entire countryside. Very interesting to watch if the country that first opted for the Eurosceptic track, how this country is going to develop in the next parliamentary elections and European elections, because the strong presence of the opposition in the big cities is already indicating that things are in move. As usual, the only big country that is stable is Germany, at least from the outside. Those that are living here and working here might have a different assessment, but from the outside, you have a stable government, you have a stable economy, and I think nobody really wants to imagine a destabilized Germany in days when Europe is so fundamentally destabilized already. The question, of course, is, do all these different types of crises, and I mentioned just some of them, do they also have something in common? Or do at least reasons that lead to this crisis, do they have similar roots? And let me try to outline at least 6 issues that I think, depending on the different countries, play a major contribution to the destabilization on the political level. One is the ongoing technological change that not all people can follow in order to really benefit from technological change to the extent that they want. Second, the financial and economic crisis of the years 2008 and 2009 in many of the member states has not yet been overcome. We still have member countries of the European Union that have not reached the GDP level of 2008. So for those countries, we are talking about a lost decade. And there are still countries where, as a result of that crisis, unemployment rates among youngsters are beyond 25%. And what we're witnessing as a collateral result of the financial and economic crisis is the decline of the middle classes in almost all the European countries, with the acceptance of those young democracies in the east of our continent who are in a different stage of development. These 3 phenomena are accompanied by a crisis of the traditional democratic system. In almost all the countries, you either are confronted with a decline or almost a destruction of the traditional big party structure on the center right and on the center left. They are replaced by Macron type of movements in France, or they are replaced by a much more differentiated multi-party system structure with 6, 7, 8 parties in government, in parliament, instead of 2 or 3 in the past. And it seems that this traditional political landscape characterizing post-war Europe, not only on the national but also on the European level, is of course under enormous pressure, either by more or less successful authoritarian ways of government or by chaotic types of organization like the one that we just can witness in France. And of course, the new architecture of geopolitics, the positioning of China, Russia, the United States, and I will come to that later on, is of course posing a fundamental question to Europe. Where is the place for Europe in this new world, and which role we are able and willing to play? And as long as this question is not answered satisfactorily, it adds to the discomfort of citizens on a broad scale. Many find the expression of their unease in nationalist or populist movements. But I think the most fundamental shift that is going on is that Europe culturally, on the level of identity, is moving strictly to the right, while Europe socially is moving to the left. So we have, in the traditional political understanding, quite paradoxical situation that these two seemingly contradictory trends are exploding the traditional party political system, and identity in many of the countries is the term of today. And when in the 90s in the United States, the famous slogan of Bill Clinton was, "It's the economy, stupid," then one could say, at least in Europe for the time being, it's the identity, stupid. That seems to be the underlying issue under Brexit, the Catalonian issue, the confrontation with xenophobia and anti-Semitism, the refugee crisis, and elements that are connected with that. So this is, in my understanding, what we see emerging. And in this situation, first of all, we have to ask ourselves what has changed around us. And secondly, we have to define what has to change in Europe in this crossroad elections that we are having in 2019 in order to play a role. Mr. Trump is very often blamed for his distance with Europe, which he is displaying in a very clear, sometimes also arrogant way, moving away from the traditional position of the United States of America that understood Europe as its closest ally, as its closest security partner, via also the NATO structure. And Mr. Trump is in many ways even hostile to Europe, especially when it comes to questions of trade, exports, and economic development. But frankly speaking, this is not the beginning. Already during the presidency of President Obama, we witnessed that the gap between the United States and Europe is growing, and that policy priorities in the United States of America in security matters move more to the Pacific and to the, let's say, emerging counterpart, which is China, and loosening the focus on Europe and especially on the Western European partners. So it began already then, but in this hostile manner, it's of course a new element that is characterizing the Trump administration. I remember when President Trump was elected, one of the most famous liberal think tankers and commentators in the United States was saying the single most greatest menace to world security nowadays are the United States of America. And it took me by surprise that something was said in such a clear manner when still being confronted with countries like North Korea, Iran, Saudi Arabia, whatever you're naming. Many countries of the world are a threat to our security. But that an American liberal is identifying the US as the single most greatest menace to world security took me by surprise. Frankly speaking, his words so far have not been backed by facts. It's true that Mr. Trump canceled the deal with Iran, and of course is strengthening language against Iran, and we will see if something new is emerging from there. But clearly he was the first US president who really engaged with North Korea and was trying to reduce the nuclear menace that for sure is present there. And we will see how his Middle East initiative will work. It seems to be obvious that he collected an alliance of states that embrace Egypt, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, to a certain extent Israel, which seem to be his club of friends in the region, with whom he tries to establish a new formula for peace in the Middle East. If this is going to work, I think we will see in the month to come, because at least in Israel, I think by the latest next year, end of next year, we are going to have elections, and this then is maybe not the best period to come up with a new initiative. But what I want to underline, because we are living in times where communication plays such an eminent role, and I'm not a professional defendant of President Trump, but so far his twittering and so far his erratic style of communication was much worse or irritating than the facts that he created on the level of international security. Mr. Putin in Russia is coming very close to the accomplishment of his major targets. He wanted to re-establish Russia as a main player in world politics, and he wanted to rebuild the old Soviet zone of influence in the area. It goes without any doubt that he re-established Russia as a global player again, clearly rejecting this humiliation that said Russia is just a regional player. So I think those who were portraying such a diminished role of Russia learned their lessons, at least in Syria and in some other parts of the area. Many ask themselves, why is President Putin so much focusing on the Ukraine? Because many would think with the recapturing of Crimea by violating international law, he reached his major strategic target. So why to continue the destabilization of the eastern Ukraine, which costs a lot of money, and which at the same time is more or less excluding 8 million Ukrainians from elections in the Ukraine, which could be quite a mighty pro-Russian vote in Ukrainian elections. But I think we have to understand, if the project of Mr. Putin to re-establish the Russian zone of influence in the area should be fulfilled, the key is, of course, not Georgia, and the key is not Armenia, but the key for this ambition is the Ukraine. And this is why the Ukrainian conflict will continue. The recent provocations from both sides, in my understanding, are connected with the presidential elections that are going to happen on the 31st of March in Kiev, where the incumbent, Mr. Poroshenko, will face quite some competition, and it's not forgiven that he will enter the second round. But I think it's very clear that Mrs. Tymoshenko is going to enter the second round. And we know her from before. She was already before President Yanukovych the one that was a master in wheeling and dealing with Mr. Putin and to reach all the agreements that have been in place in between the two countries. So my prediction on the Ukraine is that we will see some more conflicts coming up till the presidential elections, and then the cards will be laid out in a new manner, maybe searching for some reconciliation on the basis of these two states. China, despite being the greatest communist dictatorship on earth, enjoys a lot of sympathy, especially in Europe and with business. And I'm sometimes surprised how people at the same time can be so visibly anti-Russian and at the same time embrace the Chinese in a very close way. And I'm far from being anti-Chinese, but one has to understand that China tries to split the European Union. The founding of the 15+1 initiative, which means that China founded a group of countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, member states of the European Union and those that want to become members, of course, are a clear intention to create a group of countries that is blocking any anti-Chinese legislation or politics in Brussels. And smartly enough, they were entering Europe through its soft belly in a situation when savings were not high enough and foreign direct investment was languishing in Central and Eastern Europe, and the economic recuperation process was in danger. Exactly in that time, China got into those countries with quite significant investment and establishing that group. And frankly speaking, everybody talks now, and this would be an issue for an entire evening, about the One Belt, One Road initiative, which in my understanding is one of the smartest geopolitical propaganda instrument ever created, because the Chinese give the feeling and the impression to everybody that they are part of this project without making anything clear what really happens. So it's very successful on the level of propaganda. It's to a certain extent successful in the establishing of new communication lines, which means especially quick and powerful wireless communication along the entire road up to Europe. But all the investments in trains, in highways, in the maritime transportation would go far beyond also the capacity of the Chinese national budget. And therefore, what remains is very selective politics. So the country where One Belt, One Road is really visible, this clearly is Pakistan, because there the major Chinese investment happened. which, as one could understand, was not received by enthusiasm on the side of India, who is once in a while confronted with tensions with China itself, but for sure with Pakistan. So it seems that the One Belt, One Road initiative is an initiative that serves as a perfect propaganda vehicle, but will remain selective in its infrastructural expression. Nevertheless, the founding of the 15+1 in order to split the European Union was a step that is very difficult to be reversed. So what do we learn from all that? Europe cannot say the United States are not that interested anymore in us. Now we are choosing the Chinese card or the Russian card. This would be naive, because those cards are not available. Absolutely not available. There is the competition with Russia, and there is, of course, some cooperation with Russia. But let's face it, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the vast majority of the Russian elites think that the next union that should be dissolved is the European Union, because unions are not bodies for the future of mankind, and they have no trust in the European Union. They like to talk to the representatives of the capitals of the member states. So there is no Russian card available, and there is also no Chinese card available. And if American politics will be reassessed after President Trump, and if that would lead to a closer security cooperation with Europe, remains to be seen. At least I think we have to assess this issue, because with Brexit, one has to understand that the United Kingdom has intelligence capabilities, which maybe is the most important asset of the United Kingdom, unavoidable for European security. And these intelligence capabilities are the ones that have the direct information access to the United States services. Therefore, the question is, if the UK will not serve as the major linkage between the European Union and the United States of America, who will be the new player in game in Europe that can fulfill that role? Because to be only thrown around by major players in the world most probably is not a very comfortable situation for Europe. So we have to look for corporations, and we have to look for allies. China has taken a clear strategic decision. They are organizing the competition on the level of artificial intelligence with the United States of America. It is the match of Alibaba against Facebook that will be the name of the game. And of course, up to now, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft compose the World Champions League in that respect. But it seems that the two emerging powers will be Alibaba and Facebook. And some might ask, where is Europe in this context? Not being member of the the International Champions League, and not even seen as a major competitor for China, which I think is a new experience for Europe, because in the old days, we always thought that our technologies are the most developed ones. The Chinese try to copy our technologies and then to reinvent themselves. On the level of artificial intelligence, we have to witness that we are not part of the game, and that the competition is between China and the US, and the Chinese are not looking anymore to Europe. The question is, if we see all these challenges in front of us, and if we have a view to European elections in spring next year, in my understanding, these European elections can be disastrous. I have no doubt that the European People's Party is going to win the elections, remain the strongest force, but there is, of course, the imminent danger that the anti-European parties, or at least skeptics, are becoming number two. And there is the danger that Social Democrats, who have been the traditional partner of the Christian Democrats, that they are coming in only as number three or number four. And it could be for the first time since the European Parliament is in existence that the European People's Party and the Social Democrats together wouldn't have a majority anymore in the European Parliament. This, I think, would give a clear indication in which direction major factors in Europe are going to move. There is, of course, the strategy from some sides who want to domesticize some of these anti-European parties. I mean, let's face it, Mr. Orban still is member of the EPP. And there are thinkers and analysts in Italy that say Mr. Salvini will become the successor of Mr. Berlusconi, not only as the chief of government, but with his party replacing the Berlusconi party as the new party of the political right in Italy, and becoming maybe also member of the EPP. So there is a tendency that in this large camp of the EPP, people want to domesticize some of these Eurosceptic parties via integrating those parties within the framework of the EPP, which could work, but definitely would lead to a change in the vectors of the political system of Europe, because the price that you have to pay for that is that the EPP would move from the center to the right of the political spectrum. So in such a situation, what are the issues and therefore the political priorities that, from at least my point of view and my impression, should be tackled? The one is, I think that what we have defined as the Western European model of the welfare state under the present circumstances is definitely over. I think the digitalized era of work will require a fundamental reshuffle of the economic and social instruments that we used up to now. If the OECD is right in its calculation that 30 to 50% of all the jobs will be gone as an effect of digitalization, one could, of course, think that the radical shortening of working time could offer some relief. Mathematically, yes, but in reality, only to a certain extent, because jobs have to do with qualification, jobs have to do with dedication, and not everybody will be qualified for any job, because the jobs in the digitalization age will require even higher qualifications than the one that are requested by now. How can we avoid that we will have an active part of the population, so people that are working, and on the other hand, apart from pension and kids, of course, another part of the population that is a passive part that is dedicating its time mainly to drinking, to gambling, sometimes to other expressions of social frustration, as you can see it already today in some of the parts of Europe where the results of industrial decline could be seen. There was a lot of reporting nowadays about France and the so to say middle France in the Massif Central and other areas where you had traditionally quite robust industries, sometimes towns and cities of 40, 50,000 inhabitants, where nowadays you have 2,000 or 3,000 inhabitants, where vast parts of these cities are like forgotten cities, like the small Detroits in the center of Europe. Of course, with declining social services, declining educational services, declining health services, no public transport, not even bars and restaurants to go. And the only place you find in many of these towns is that you have a betting cafe, where people go in and bet on horse riding or whatever, and have a couple of drinks. So this is what I mean with passive part of the population. And already as a result of the decline of the industrial age, Europe produced such a passive part of the population. It was easier in countries where you could move to pension and people got old. But with people at the age of 40 or 45 that do not have a real role in our society, this danger of a split in the digitalized era between active and passive part of the population is an eminent one. So we will need political and social concepts that try to embrace the entire population and not allow ourselves to say we are going to accept that division in active and passive. So even if people are only dedicating 10 or 15 hours a week or 20 hours to do something meaningful, it's better than they do nothing. And the question that always comes up is, okay, but how we are going to pay for all that? And I think this is a very legitimate question. But it's a question that we could answer. If work is not the predominant factor of human expression in future anymore, because a lot of things are going to be done by computers, robots, and whatsoever, why should our taxation system be mainly based on this scarce resource which we call work? And maybe we are coming in a situation where we are not going to tax work anymore, but that we have robust taxes on wealth, on capital gains, on profits, on different types of consumption, and of course, on environmental consumption. The digitalization is putting the shape of our taxation system in front of the most radical choices that we ever witnessed since 1945. And I do not believe that small tiki-taka adaptations are going to be able to solve the issue. And I outlined this question of work in digitalization only to highlight one of the major challenges in front of us. And in connection with that, I think that Europe also has to decide that Europe will not be a bundle of mega cities, and this is it. In almost all reports about the global development, we foresee that the vast majority in the world of the future will live in mega cities. The events in France, what you see in many parts of Italy and Spain, and also in smaller countries, shows us that European civilization will not be based only on cities and on megacities. And if you're not offering a life perspective to people on the countryside, you will be confronted with incredible social and political backlashes. And therefore, I do not see the future of Europe as a Europe only of megacities, but we have to continue this balanced lifestyle that is one of the most important features of our European lifestyle up to now. We have to change the priorities of the European Union. I'm an ardent European, but I can tell you, I'm so often fed up if I read some of the concrete legislation of the European Parliament and the European Commission interfering in issues that, in my understanding, is not the task of Europe. And I think this type of perfectionism creates bureaucratic apparatuses that are difficult to handle and that stretch out into people's life where it's not necessary. I would feel perfectly comfortable with a European Union that would take as its priorities foreign and security policy in the front of the challenges that we are facing right now, a European Union that tries to find a common solution to the refugee crisis, a European Union that is embracing the area of digitalization by innovative means, not only technical ones, but also social ones, and a European Union that tries to establish a tax system that is ready for the new times. This, in my understanding, are the main prerequisites in order to defend Europe as a continent of liberty, freedom, and social prosperity. And I think we are Europeans, and I speak for me and the ones like me. We are Europeans because we still believe that a society that is in balance, that is based on the contribution of each and everybody, is the best guarantee for freedom and democracy. And in order to recapture that vision, we have to make some tough choices in the years to come. And before we are coming to decisions, we should vigorously discuss, based on the paradoxical thinking that is required in our times, what we are opting for. And I, today in the evening, I'm ready to start this discussion with you. Thank you very much.